This is not the man God creates in the book of Genesis. But now, thousands of years after the Bible was written, science has confirmed the essence of its story. There was one man whose DNA survives in every man on earth today. His Garden of Eden was likely East Africa. Other humans came before him, but only after him did we become truly modern. Scientific Adam unites all men today.
First, we'll start off with identifying some Euro myths involved in the terminology of this land. America. The term America, according to U.S. history, was supposedly taken from the Italian navigator Amerigo Vespucci. The truth is, the term is a two-part word. Amer, taken from the French word more, which were the inhabitants of West Africa, Morocco, and Mali. These Africans were also referred to as Mer, Moor, or Morenos in Spain to mean black. The term Moor is the root word of the Latin term amor, or the French word amour, or the Italian term amore, which means beloved, and was the term used in reference to the Moroccan kings who sailed via Spain and became religious leaders of the Vatican. The original Vatican priesthood was African. Catholic equals cat, holistic or holy cat of Egyptian symbolism, symbolized by the Sphinx. The Moroccan priesthood oversaw the papal government. The term Rika derived from the Middle English word reek to mean power realm. Power was determined by bloodlines and by wealth. Thus the term rich or reich, and referred to the Moroccans, the wealthy Moroccans that was depicted in the films Casablanca and The King and I. The term American literally refers to the early inhabitants of this land who wore gold in their noses. Next term, Indian. The term Indian was first coined by Christopher Columbus during his first journey in 1492. Columbus was under the impression that when he arrived in the Bahamas, he was in the East Indies. When Columbus encountered the Arawaks, he referred to them as Indians because their skin color and hair texture was similar to that of Hindu people of Asia. The term India only applies to inhabitants of the country of India, not the indigenous people of America. Today, the term Indian is officially used as a term of determination by the United States federal government. However, there is no clear and concise definition for the term when it deals with the classification and tribal eligibility. For argument's sake, though, this term will appear various times throughout this lecture. Native American. The term native is from the Middle English word natif, which means belonging to a particular place by birth. It is a misconception that the term Native American refers to the so-called American Indian. The truth is that anyone born in America is a Native American, but not necessarily an American Indian. Indigenous. The term indigenous means native, coming from the Latin word indigena. The difference between indigenous and native is that native refers to residence, while indigenous refers directly to ethnicity. Within the word indigenous is the word gene, which means to give birth or freeborn. American citizen. The term American citizen refers to persons or an inhabitant of a city or town who is entitled to the rights and privileges of a free man. American citizens must be entitled or granted the various rights of the nation, but not necessarily the same rights as an indigenous or native people. The people must become members of the United States in most cases and withdraw their membership with their birth nation. And finally, illegal alien. The term illegal alien refers to persons of another country who are not naturalized or granted citizenship. We will need to pay attention to these terms as we go further through this lecture. The true story of America has been a forgotten one, hidden deep in the portals of time, existing under the notion that it would never be uncovered and revealed. It was unknown for hundreds of years. We were only provided false information in order to hide the greater truth. No, black Indians are not solely the result of African slaves mixing with red Indians as many other black Indian sources would have you to believe. This is only a small portion of the legacy. Black Indians are indigenous to this land before the so-called red man, before the Europeans, before the so-called Bering Strait. We, the Olmecs, Washita, Yamasee, Moors, and mound builders planted the seed of this civilization in this country, America. Today we are the remnants of these elders, and it is time that we reveal the bigger picture, our true legacy, not as former African slaves, not as immigrants, but as what we were and what we are. This educational series will chronicle the original indigenous people of America and how they came to be known as the people we know today. The indigenous people of this land, we are still here. Now, without further ado, we will delve directly into the indigenous peoples of this land. The indigenous. When the enormous monoliths were uncovered from Mexico, the sculptured images that were carved to form 24-ton heads from a single mass of basalt rock had been discovered. No one suspected this mysterious part of a civilization that only seemed to have vanished. At the cultural paradox of this civilization, La Venta, 18 miles from the Gulf of Mexico, 4 colossal heads were unearthed. The monoliths had been carbon dated. The results of the carbon-14 tests of the stone heads found in Mexico caused a startling uproar amongst archaeological circles. Various additional testing was performed. However, the earliest date that the carbon testing came up with regarding the stone images was the year 291 BC. As more diggings were performed in Middle America, larger heads were discovered. 24 tons was the average sum of the weight. The new discoveries were even more mysterious, for the colossal heads continued to turn up even earlier dates. 4 heads in all were excavated at the city of La Venta alone, with the largest head standing 9 feet tall. Ancient Middle American civilizations, or Mesoamerica antiquity, is divided into 3 epochs: Archaic, before Christ; Classic, during the first 1,000 years AD; and Post-Classic, from 1000 AD to Spanish conquest. The monolith of La Venta was dated and placed in the Archaic period, which proved the existence of a civilization in Mesoamerica thousands of years before organized monotheistic religions. Perhaps more staggering than the result of the carbon dating of these stone figures is the apparent construction and proportions of the monoliths. According to archaeological circles, the statues were constructed from one massive chunk of basalt block mined from stone quarries 80 miles away and transported to the center of La Venta with a sum weight of 20 to 40 tons each. It seems these stones were rolled over vast tracts of land or transported down a river on wooden rafts, however, presenting somewhat of an illogical and even incomprehensible method of material transportation. The monoliths proved to be only elementary in cultural archaeology. At present, between 25 and 40 Archaic period Mesoamerican sites have been discovered. The majority of these finds have occurred in the states of Veracruz, which totals 246 recorded pieces with over 180 sculptures, altars, and stone heads. The revelation of this hidden civilization reconstructed the indigenous history that has now been extended to reveal a hidden past. It is apparent that the Archaic period preceded even some of the great civilizations of the East, 900 to 400 BC. The people of this period were not primates. These archaic indigenous inhabitants belonged to a class of Homo sapiens, thus leading to the belief that the ancient America, despite the narrow-minded kaleidoscope view of cave dwellers and tree climbers, was a highly advanced civilization. We see this in the advanced artistry and sculpturing, which was quite different than the art and sculpturing of tribal cultures. Mesoamerica archaeology proves enough data to suggest that these inhabitants were a high-status group with the presence of elite leaders, a military force, a political hierarchy, and a quite obviously, or at least sensible, penal system, as opposed to a primitive tribal culture's vigilante methods of punishment. Historians speculate on the actual racial identity of these inhabitants. Many hypotheses suggest that the archaic inhabitants were of Mayan linguistic stock. The contradiction to this hypothesis will be that the inhabitants spoke an ancestral form of Mixoquine. Other historians speculate that the people who populated Mesoamerica were Mongoloid people who crossed over between Siberia and Alaska and were called Paleo-Siberian or ice hunters. Upon research in the etymology of the term Paleo-Siberian, we find paleo from the Greek word pale to mean ancient or primitive. Siberian has dual meanings. Sib from the Greek word sipa to mean kinship, family related by blood, and Aryan from the Sanskrit word Arya to mean noble, in reference to the Persian language. Arya also denotes a sub-tribe of people who migrated from Turkey into Palestine and were given the name Caucasian from the regions of the Caucasus Mountains. However, the stone images were not the depiction of Siberians or Mongoloids. The archaeologists are not in agreement with the identity of these inhabitants, or more correctly, have denied indisputable truth of their origin. However, since the mysterious unearthing of the ancient civilizations, one name has surfaced from later transcriptions. The name was Olmec. Who were these people called Olmec? Can we speculate that these people of the colossal heads were Asians who crossed the Bering Strait, or Siberian icemen who migrated from Europe? Jose Maria y Serrano, upon excavating one of the monolith heads in this region of San Andreas Tuxtla, published a short passage in the Bulletin of the Mexican Geographical Statistical Society, and I quote, "As a work of art, it is without exaggeration a magnificent sculpture. But what most amazes me was the type that it represents, a Ethiopian African. I conclude that there had doubtlessly been black Negroids in this region from the very earliest ages of the world." Unquote. In 1939, Dr. Matthew Sterling led a joint team from the National Geographic Society into the Gulf of Mexico to spearhead a major digging operation in Veracruz to unearth the monolithic heads. Sterling concluded, and I quote, "The features are bold and amazingly Negroid in character." Unquote. The archaeological cultural data overwhelmingly confirms the depiction of Negroid faces. Further archaeological evidence of the Negroid in ancient America is found in the Monte Alban culture, which seems to have begun at the end of Olmec culture. In Monte Alban, 140 Negroid-type figures have been discovered. Upon archaeological research, there is no logical denying of the Negroidness found in the art of the ancient Americas. Although there has been denial amongst historians, archaeologists have indeed confirmed at least 4 major facts. Number 1, the Olmecs date back to the Archaic period. Number 2, the Olmec civilization parallels the dynastic periods of Egypt. Number 3, the Olmecs were not Paleo-Siberians or evolving Neanderthals. And number 4, evidence points to the Olmecs being of African ancestry. Skeletons have also been unearthed in pre-Columbian layers in the valley of the Pecos River that flows through Texas and New Mexico and empties into the Rio Grande of the Gulf of Mexico. Professor Houghton, a physical anthropologist, concluded, and I quote, "The Pecos skull resembles most closely the cranial of Negroid groups coming from Africa, where Negroes commonly have some perceptible infusion of Hamitic blood." Unquote. The Pecos skull resembles most closely the cranial of Negroid groups coming from Africa, where Negroes commonly have some perceptible infusion of Hamitic blood. Unquote. Professor Houghton refers to Hamitic blood. Hamitic blood is the blood of the Negroid, since the Ham, Shemites, were the dark seed which were forbidden to interbreed with the Canaanites. The word Ham translates as black in biblical Aramaic. Finds like these, in addition to the Negroid-style heads, forces us to consider the parallel between ancient America and Africa. However, historians dismiss these similarities as mere coincidence. Archaeologists, on the other hand, conclude that the Olmecs who sculpted these monoliths have been shown to be absolute masters of realistic portraiture and did not arrive at the distinct Negroid features by accident. It is also noted that there could not possibly be a coincidence of stylization of a distinct people with facial features and characteristics which separates them from the features and characteristics of all other races on this planet. There can be no room for geographical coincidence that the very period that the Negroid appeared in Mexico, that was the same period when the first pyramid, mummies, and hieroglyphics began to appear in Mesoamerica as well. Is it a coincidence that the Teotihuacan head of pre-Columbian Mexico greatly resembles early Mandingo clay heads and Nigerian images? Many of the historians today have confirmed to the speculation of the Olmec monolith heads. They cannot explain the representation of the Negroid. Despite the coloration, the fullness of the lips, prognathism, tattoos, tribal markings, and tribal scarification, kinky hair, the broad nose, and the Egyptian-style military accessories. Historians now speculate that the sculptures were not constructed by Negroid people, but perhaps by Asians. If this had indeed been the case, why would people erect such huge monuments of Negroid representation? Why would Asians build colossal monuments to portray the Negroid of Africa when they had their own gods and legendary heroes? So realistic are these representations of the Negroid that it is extremely difficult to suggest that these figures were constructed by anyone other than Negroids themselves. Were the Asians attempting to construct an Egyptian metropolis by erecting Negroid stone heads, pyramids, clay pottery, which is identical to the Egyptian and even the Nigerian art? How could the Asians arrive at the startling similarities between the Olmec civilization and the Egyptian civilization? Even more absurd than these claims is how the Asians built these monolith heads. It is interesting to note the similarities between the mysteries of the construction of the Olmec heads and the pyramids of Egypt. both Negroid civilizations. The historical professor's hypotheses are in fact denials of an ancient Negroid civilization in America, which predates all other ancient civilizations and cultures in America. No one has denied that the Olmec civilization is perhaps the oldest of America that stretches back into antiquity, nor is there any legitimate denial that the Olmec monoliths represent Negroid people. However, there is denial that the true indigenous people of America were Negroid. Research shows that the Olmecs did not mysteriously vanish as suggested by historians, but that the Olmecs migrated far north and mixed in with the 4th century Chinese missionaries under Buddhist monk Hu Shen, who traveled to what is now California and produced what Columbus mistakenly called Indian and the British called the Red Man. Other Olmecs migrated to Southeast America and established settlements. Research suggests that Olmecs mixed in with Negroid traders from Morocco, the Moors, thus becoming known as Washoe, and established governments and sovereign nations thousands of years prior to the arrival of the Europeans. These claims have thus been repudiated by historical circles who have gone beyond the call of duty to counteract the suggestion that the original Native American, in every sense of the word, were African, Negroid, Black, Egyptian, or Nubian people, and not red men living in huts and teepees. So, who were the Olmecs? Where did they come from and why? Why does the Olmec culture parallel Egyptian culture? Who are the black gods carved in the stone found in Mexico? Did the Olmecs simply vanish, or do they still exist today under various names like African American, Negro, Black, Mexican, Puerto Rican? Is there a cover-up governed by archaeological and historical circles to hide the present identity of Olmecs in order to protect the land that would otherwise technically and literally be owned by these indigenous people? We owe it to ourselves to unearth the largest find to date. This find is that of the very first Americans. Where did the Olmecs come from? The Olmecs came from Nuba in Central Africa, and they migrated to America, in which they named in their Kushite language Utala, which means vacate. When the Olmecs discovered that there was actually a North Utala and South Utala, the word Utala became plural, which became Atlan, which is where the word Atlantis and Atlanta came from. The Olmecs were a tribe in Africa called Dogon in Mali. When the Dogons migrated to America, they also imported the rubber tree, which is only indigenous to Africa. The Dogons used the sap from the rubber tree to make shoes, coats, capes, and they were the first to introduce soles on shoes in the New World. The name Olmec means rubber people. The rubber was also used to make large balls for the Olmecan ball game ceremonies, which was played in large stone arenas. When Christopher Columbus arrived in the West, he states that he saw natives kicking around a large ball that was made of some type of acacia. Columbus took some of these trees and balls back to Spain with him, and today, soccer is the favorite national sport of Spain. These Olmecs set up empires and cities that predates even the Inca, the Aztecs, and the Mayans. The Olmecs were not Siberians. The Olmecs were dark-skinned, big-lipped, wide-nosed Africans, just as they are portrayed in the stone monoliths. The step pyramids of Egyptians closely resembles the step pyramids found in the Americas. The double crown of Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt with the bird and the serpent is also found in Olmecan culture, with Upper and Lower Egypt being Northern and Southern America. The Mexicans have 4 calendars. The 4th calendar is identical to the Egyptian calendar. In Mexico, there was found a type of paper made from a specific type of wood pulp that scientists say can only be found in Egypt. Even the ceremonial dance of the Hopi Indians is identical to the Dogon's Bado dance of Africa, using the same symbols and spirit names. Various tribes such as the Osage and the Apache use the crescent moon symbol, which is the national symbol of Angola, Mauritania, Tanzania, the Sahara, and Algeria, all found on the continent of Africa. Now, you may be wondering, hey, he just kind of skimmed over that little part about the blacks mating with the Chinese to produce the Red Indian. Well, I'm going to attack that right now. You may be wondering, were there even blacks in China? And the answer to that is yes. There were indeed blacks in ancient China. The skeletal remains from southern China are predominantly Negroid. The people practice single burials, which is an African ritual. In northern China, the blacks founded many civilizations. The three major empires of China was the Jia dynasty, the Shang Yin dynasty, and the Zhao dynasty. The Zhao dynasty was the first dynasty founded by the Mongoloid people in China, called the Hua. The founders of the Jia and the Shang came from the fertile African crescent by way of Iran. Chinese civilization began along the Yellow River. Here the soil was fertile, and black Chinese farmers grew millet 4,000 years ago, and later soybeans. They also raised pig and cattle. By 3500 BC, the blacks in China were raising silkworms and making silk. The cultural hero Huang Di is a direct link of Africa. His name is pronounced in Old Chinese as Yuhai Handi or Hu Nak Kunte. He was supposed to have arrived in China from the west in 2282 BC and settled along the banks of the Low River in Shaanxi. This literal translation of Huang Yi to Hu Nak Kunte is interesting because Kunte is a common clan name among the Manding speakers. The Africans or blacks that founded the civilization in China were often called Li Min, meaning black-headed people, by the Zhao dynasty. This term has affinity to the Sumero-Akudan term Sa-ge-ga, black-headed people. These Li men are associated with the Chinese cultural hero Yao. We know very little about the sounds of the ancient Chinese because ancient Chinese was very different from Old Chinese and Middle Chinese and the modern Chinese dialects. This results from the fact that the Chinese dynasties were founded by a diverse ethnic group. Jia and Shang Li, i.e. Black Shang, were founded by Dravidian and Manding speakers. Shang Yin was founded by classic Mongoloids, and the Zhao by contemporary Chinese. This explains the difference in pronunciation for ancient Chinese spoken by the Jia and Shang peoples and Old and Middle Chinese, or a variant thereof which is spoken by the Zhao people. The Shang characters compare favorably to the ancient Proto-Saharan script used by the Harappans in the Indus Valley, and the Manding script used in the ancient Sahara and Crete. Clyde Winters outlined the spread of the Proto-Saharan script to Harappa and throughout the Sahara African and Asian by the Dravidians and the Manding. Evidence of Chinese writing first appears around 2000 BC as pottery markings. The shell and bone characters represented writing. They were not pictures but wedges similar to African cuneiform. The Shang symbols compare favorably with ancient Manding symbols as well. Although there are different contemporary pronunciations for these symbols, they have the same meaning and shape. This suggests the genetic relationship between these scripts because we know that the present pronunciation of the Chinese symbol probably has little relationship to the ancient pronunciation of Chinese spoken in the Jia and Shang times when these characters were first used. This cognation of script supports the proposed Dravidian and Manding migration and settlement of China during the Jia times. The identification of the first hero of China, Hu Nat Kunte, as a member of the Kunte clan of the Manding speakers of Africa is supported by the close relationship between the Manding languages and the Chinese. Even though we do not know the ancient pronunciation of many Chinese signs, many Chinese and Manding words share analogy and suggest a Manding substratum for Chinese. I mentioned Black Shang, so I will further explain. There were two Shang empires. The first Shang dynasty was Shang Li, meaning Black Shang. It was ruled by Li Shang, or Black Shang. For the last 273 years of the Shang Empire, the capital was situated at Anyang. The Shang Empire based at Anyang was founded by the Yin nationality. We call this empire Shang Yin. Thus we have Shang Li Empire and the Shang Yin Empire. The Yin were classical Mongoloid people related to the Thai and other small Mongoloid Austronesian speaking people situated in Southeast Asia. The use of the blackbird as the father of Zhai relates to the blackbird as a popular totem of black ethnic groups in China. This indicates that the founders of Shang were of mixed origin. The bird myth I just mentioned, which is centered on the east coast of China, suggests black origin for Shang, since this area was the heartland of ancient China. Both the ancient Chinese and Africans had similar naming practices. As in Africa, the Shang child had both a day name and a regular name. The Shang child was named according to the days of the sun on which he was born. There were 10 days in each sun. These days are called the 10 celestial signs. In the mulberry tree tradition, one day 10 suns rose from a mulberry, and the archer Yi shot them down. He actually only shot 9 down. The suns in reality were birds. The bird myth refers to the blackbirds that founded the Shang dynasty. The fact that only one of the 10 birds survived the arrows of the archer of Yi may be related to the unification of the 10 clans of the Shang dynasty. The reference to blackbirds in the Chinese literature relate to the African origin of the Shang rulers. The use of the term blackbird relates to the fact that these blacks had a bird as their totem. There is a similar account in Native American history, where the blackbird rescues the red bird from the white bird, which retreats back into the caves. This analogy is a reference to the Negroid releasing the red Indian from the clutches of the European colonialism. We know that birds do not live in caves. The cave is a reference to the mountains of Europe, the Caucasus Mountains. And as far as blacks in Asia today, many Africans and Chinese mixed and moved far north into Tibet, where they become known as nomads and live a very similar life to the Africans in Kenya. The Dravidian speakers originally came from Nubia. They were related to the Sea Group people. The Shang culture was founded by the Kushites, thus the name Yi, meaning great bowman, thus corresponding to Stu, the name for the founders of the Tatseti, the first monarchy in history. The Yi seem to have lived in both North and South China. Fu Su Nin in Yi His Tunga Shao makes it clear that the Shang culture bearer remained allied to the rest of the Yi people who lived in southern China. The founders of Jia are usually referred to as Yue, as opposed to Yi. It would appear that most of Yi were Dravidian speakers, while Yue were Manding speakers. The first Shang king of Zhuan Wang, meaning black king. Zhuan means black. He was called Zhuan Di, meaning black emperor. The founder of the Shang dynasty was called Zhuan Nao, meaning black bird. Another Shang king was called Zhuan Mu, meaning black oxen. And the list goes on and on and on and on. Previously I mentioned that the Olmecs and the Chinese combined to produce the Red Indian, and I will delve deeper into that right now. In the 4th century, a Chinese missionary under the Shang dynasty named Hu Xian came to America in search of his people, who were the East Yi, meaning the black Chinese. When the Chinese arrived, they encountered the Olmecs, who had already been living on the land. The Chinese considered the black Olmecs as the descendants of the black Chinese, Yi people. Hu Xian's people settled and mixed in with the Olmecs and produced the Aboriginal. The Olmecs gave the lower kingdom to the Aborigines. The Aborigines called the land Mujian, which is a combination of the Olmecan Ashuric Aramaic word Mu, which means one, and the Chinese word Zhan, named after Hu Xian. Did you know that there was a province in China today called Zhan, and that this is the site of one of the only Chinese pyramids? Mujian became Mijian and eventually became Mekjian, or Mexico. The Aborigines called themselves Mexicans, and they remixed with the Olmecs, which resulted in a sub-tribe called the Hopi. The Hopi clan was taught the religion of the Dogon and given the secret of the stars. Several hundred years later, the Hindu East Indians arrived in Mexico, and they bred with the Mexicans and produced Mongoloid tribe types like the Inuit and Eskimo, who migrated far north into Canada and Alaska. Out of the Mexican also came the Aztec, Inca, Toltec, Mixtec, and the Mayans, which were the 5 barbarian nations. The Mayans rejected their Olmec ancestry and gravitated towards their Chinese ancestry. The Mayans began practicing human sacrifices and cannibalism. The Mayans were banished by the original Olmecs and were told to leave or be destroyed. The Mayan relocated and sailed east to Asia and mixed in the Mongols of Southeast Asia and became known as Angkor. Today, the Angkors no longer go by that ancient name. Their modern-day name is Cambodian. Yes, the Cambodians are really the Native Americans that were banished. This is why the ruins in ancient Cambodia are identical to the ruins of the Mayan Empire. History claims that the Mayan civilization just vanished. The word Mayan means illusions because it seems as if they disappeared overnight. The Mayans didn't just disappear. An entire ethnic group just simply vanished overnight. They simply packed up and moved to the other side of the planet. And you might be wondering, am I saying that the Red Indian is an Aborigine? Well, the Red Indian is a result of mixing between Olmecs and Chinese. This is why you have some Native Americans with dark skin and Negroid features, and some with light skin and Mongoloid features. Olmecs were indigenous Americans. Chinese were immigrants. Mexicans are Aborigines, who were the combination of Olmecs and Chinese. The East Indians that came here were also immigrants. As for the tribes of North America, the tribes of North America were a result of Olmec and Mexicans. However, some of the Mexicans continued to mix with the Chinese and produced yellow tribes like Pueblo and Manso. The yellow tribes mixed in with each other and produced tribes like the Chinook, Tutuni, Kalupaya, Chumash, Oinut, and others. Tribes broke off from each other and produced even more tribes that settled in California. The darker-skinned tribes were the tribes that managed to contain much of the Olmec blood, like the Arapaho, Arikara, the Blackfoot, Cheyenne, Crow, Apache, Mandan, the Pawnee, and the Shoshone. In the 15th century, all of this changed. The Europeans arrived for the first time, the Spaniards, French, British, Italians, and Portuguese. The Europeans mixed in with all of the tribes, black, red, and yellow, and they produced even more stocks. Today you will find white Native American tribes, The tribes that did not wish to mix with the Europeans were destroyed. The Incans were destroyed by the Spanish, who stole their culture and are now calling themselves Hispanic, which is a term that was popularized and some say even coined by Ronald Reagan. As far as the darker tribes or the black tribes, the Olmecs migrated into two directions. One group of the Olmecs migrated into the eastern islands near the Bermuda Triangle and settled in the islands of Jamaica, Haiti, the Bahamas, Trinidad, and Barbados. The Olmecs set up colonies on these islands and became known as the Arawaks. These were the people Christopher Columbus encountered. The Spanish and the British mixed in with the Arawaks. The Olmecs of Haiti went back to their African roots and began practicing their religion called Yoruba, which is mistakenly called Voodoo. The Arawaks mixed in with the Portuguese and produced a tribe of half Negroid, half Latin called Taino. The Taino were invaded by another tribe called the Caribs, who were sadistic cannibalists. The Caribs migrated to an island known as the Caribbean. The other group of Olmecs traveled north and settled in Southeast America and became known as the Washoe, which means raccoon people. These people settled into areas of Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Georgia. The Washoe mixed with the Malian Moors of Africa who also came over. The result of this mixing was a tribe of pure-blooded black Native Americans called Yamasee or Yamasee. The Yamasee resided in Georgia and were the mother tribe of all dark southeastern and eastern tribes. Yamasee is a direct descendant of the Olmecs through the Washita Moors. The Washita is a derivative of the term Wichita, who are known as Kit-Kittish, which means raccoon eyes, which refer to the black Native Americans because of their faces. Thus the term coons was used to identify a black person. The Yamasee lived in Georgia on the Ocmulgee River near Macon, Georgia, and where the early Yamasee mounds were discovered. Today, Macon is also the home of the Harriet Tubman African American Museum. The Yamasee is the mother tribe of the Creeks, the Seminoles, the Apaches, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Catawbas, and the Cherokee. In the 1700s, the British, French, and Spaniards mixed into these tribes. In 1715, the Yamasee rose in rebellion against the English and allied with the Spaniards. Some of the Yamasee Creeks migrated to what is known as Savannah, Georgia, and became outlaws under the tribal name Yamacraw. The British began taking women and children into slavery. The native black American men mixed in with runaway African slaves. A war broke out between the Yamasee and the British in 1715, the Yamasee Uprising. Throughout the 1700s, many tribes were slaughtered. The remnants of these tribes band together to create an alliance. The newly formed tribes of Yamasee, Coosa, Cowan, Congaree were known as the Catawbas. The Catawbas spoke a dialect of ancient Kushite language, which was bits and pieces of the original Olmec African language. The Catawbas lived in South Carolina and were enemies of the Shawnee and the Iroquois, who were tribes that had mixed with the French and became almost full-blooded European. Some of the Catawbas joined the Alabama Creeks and mixed in with the Spaniards, losing much of their African traits. After the Yamasee Uprising, Native American power collapsed in Georgia and Alabama. Many of the Yamasee escaped to Florida, where they joined runaway African slaves to form what later would be called Runaways or Seminoles. Other tribes which came from this union were the Oconee and the Hittite. The Oconee relocated from the Oconee River and moved westward to the Chattahoochee, where they mixed with the Lower Creeks, which resided in the areas of Pensacola and Tallahassee, Florida. All of these tribes were originally black tribes of the Yamasee. And as far as the Yamasee mixing with the African slaves, the Yamasee and African runaways had a few things in common. They were both of the same ethnic background, they were able to blend in with each other, and they both had hatred for the British. Throughout slavery, thousands of African slaves escaped the plantations and sought refuge with the neighboring Native American tribes. The natives had an incredible knowledge of outdoor survival and location. It is often believed that Harriet Tubman herself, who freed slaves via the Underground Railroad, was herself a black Native American because of her knowledge of the paths and the terrain. Many African slaves and Native Americans mixed. Even the red tribes took in African slaves. Some tribes even owned slaves. However, unlike the Europeans, Africans were mostly considered indentured servants and treated as human beings by their Native American owners. Today there are red Seminoles and black Seminoles, red Creeks and black Creeks, red Cherokee and black Cherokee. The Seminoles, they did oppose slavery. The U.S. Army prosecuted the Seminoles because they opposed slavery. The Seminoles realized that the people who were being sold into slavery were a faction of them, distant cousins, relatives in a way. The black Seminoles was the only tribe at the time that opposed slavery. U.S. slaveholders tried to cause tension between red Seminoles and black Seminoles. Thus, a war erupted between the Seminoles and the U.S. slaveholders. Seminoles and African slaves joined together and attacked slave plantations. General Andrew Jackson prepared to wipe out the Seminoles. Jackson gathered Creek tribes along the U.S. soldiers to destroy the Seminoles. This war lasted for decades and extended all throughout Florida. By 1826, wealthy Creeks who had also owned slaves were sent to persuade the Seminoles to join in on the slave trade. When the Seminoles once again refused, Seminoles were kidnapped and sold on the southern slave markets. The U.S. Army was also trying to push the red Seminoles out of Florida onto reserved Indian territory west of the Mississippi. The Army was faced with much opposition, with the resistance of the Seminoles who were guided by the red Seminole chief Osceola. The red Seminoles knew that the whites would not follow after them for their fear of alligators and snakes. The black Seminoles remained in Texas and moved into Oklahoma, Idaho, and mixed in with the Blackfeet, Comanche, the Kiowa, Apache, the Mandan, the Omaha, Osage, Pawnee, and Arikara, and their closest relatives, the Wichita. You know, people wonder if the actual Blackfoot Indians got their name because they were black Americans. And, you know, that's not necessarily so. The Blackfoot Indians got their name because they would stain their moccasins with burnt ashes. The Blackfoot tribe was at one time Saskatchewan Native Americans who relocated to the Montana in search for buffalo. The Blackfoot or Blackfeet consists of three divisions: the Siksika, the Kainai, and the Piegan. The entire group is known as Blood and are descendants of the Wichita Yamasee Moors. If you look closely at many Native American tribes, you can still see their African traits. You may wonder, are there any black tribes left? There is a woman named Verdiachi Washita Turner Gaston L. Bay, and she is the legal heir by blood to the Mason Rouge land grants that were willed to her by her great-great-grandfather Henry Turner. Verdiachi's land is the District of Louisiana, which is named after her great-great-great-grandfather's friend, Louis Bogeny, who sold the land to Joseph de Maison Rouge in 1795. Joseph had a daughter named Anne, in which the land went to her. Annie named the land Louisiana after Louis and Annie. In 1848, the U.S. government took the Turners to court to take the District of Louisiana. However, the government lost, and the land was granted to the heirs of Henry Turner, Verdiachi Washita Turner Gaston L. Bay. Verdiachi has set up a sovereign nation of Washita Moors that is recognized by the United States government. The Subcommission on Prevention of Discrimination and Protection of Minority Workers Groups on indigenous populations recognize the Wichita as the oldest indigenous people on the earth. The U.S. government does not own the District of Louisiana, as we may believe. Also, the state of Georgia is owned by a Yamasee. It is documented. Many Native Americans signed treaties with the U.S. government, but never actually sold any of their land over. Technically, the land still belongs to the so-called Indians, not the federal government. So you may be wondering if I'm trying to say that out of the 550 some odd Native American tribes, they're all descendants of black people. I'm saying that all so-called American Indians descended from the Mexican Olmecs and the various African and Asian mixtures throughout. How does this make other Native Americans feel, especially today's Red Indian? It is important that we as Americans understand the origin of the so-called American Indian, and it is important that we accept the truth. Black Indians are no more native than the so-called red man in culture. The culture and religion that is practiced by today's Native Americans is the natural, non-theological concept of the Malian Moors of Africa, the Olmecs, and the Aztecs of Mexico, as well as the early concept of the mound builders. There are various tribes today that will admit to their African ancestry. The Hopis, Apache, Aztec, Zuni, Nez Perce, Miami, Blackfoot, Catawba, and Seminole all possess knowledge of African ancestry. What's more important is not the feeling concerning indigenous people, but more so the truthful data and the validity and acceptance of that data. You may be asking, why do red Native Americans believe that they are the first? Well, many red Native Americans are well aware of the information that I've just presented to you, and some are not aware. Tribes like the Hopi, Aztec, Apache, Pueblo, Seminole, Creek, Tuscaros, and Susquehanna have documents in their possession that tells the stories of the black gods who gave them birth. In fact, the Hopi Book of the Stars that was given to them by the Dogons tells that when the forefathers, Africans, reclaim their throne, the black and red tribes will join together and overcome their oppressors. There is a similar parable in most Native American cultures that speaks of the white eagle who has captured the red eagle, until the black eagle freed the red eagle. The white eagle retreated into the cave from which he came. Look up this story. It's an actual Native American culture. It is just as important for Native Americans to understand true history as it is for black Americans to understand true history. Blacks have been convinced that they are all ex-African slaves. Of course, this is a lie. There had been blacks in this country for thousands of years before the first Europeans. There are millions of blacks in America today who, if they trace their family heritage back, will not find any African slavery in their family. Many blacks are children of the Yamasee, Seminole, Creek, Cherokee, Blackfoot, Shoshone, etc. However, the U.S. government, in order to protect their best interests, has kept most of this information and true history from us. The U.S. government has convinced us to classify ourselves as a title that the European political system created in order to place us in a certain social bracket, African American. As an African American, we have no inalienable or indigenous rights under the Constitution. Even worse, as an African American Christian, we dig an even deeper hole for ourselves. As black Christians, we have to admit two things. We are former slaves by calling ourselves African, and we are former slaves who converted to the slave owner's religion. Thus, we sever any connection to sovereignty or self-identity. As African American Christians, we literally become dependent on the government and relinquish all indigenous and self-governing classifications. Thus, we throw ourselves on the mercy of the U.S. judicial system. Native Americans have what is called autonomy or self-government, similar to diplomatic immunity. As indigenous people, we have the right to set up our own sovereign nations. We govern our own judicial, legislative, and penal system. As African Americans, we waive the right of self-governing and indigenous rights by admitting that we are immigrants, came over from somewhere else, and not indigenous. The African slave trade. Much of the so-called African slave trade was fabricated and widely exaggerated. There was no trade. An independent source showing that the so-called Indians on the eastern seaboard, also called Terra Nova or Moors, is called the book African and Native Americans by Jack D. Forbes. He shows in the book how many so-called Native American Indians were sold into slavery in Africa and Europe. This is the opposite direction in which we were taught the slave trade went. These Native Americans or Indians were classified as Negroes and blacks in the slave books of Seville, Spain and elsewhere. On page 29 he says, and I quote, "Slaves from Terra Nova show up in the slave markets of Seville and Valencia very soon after 1500. For example, in Valencia during the period to 1516, we find in 1503 Miguel Man, in 1505 Juan and Pedro, and in 1507 Antonio and Juan Amarco. In 1515 Ali, now Melchor, and in 1516 Catalina. They were all classified as Negroes." Unquote. Now, think about this. If we were first brought to North America around 1619, or even as early as 1555 for that matter, then how were they taking slaves from Newfoundland to Europe, all before 1520? Keep in mind that one of the Native Americans even had the name Ali, and all were classified as Negroes once they reached Valencia. How did a Native American in 1515 have a Moorish name, Ali? At least 3,000 Americans, so-called Indians, are known to have been shipped to Europe between 1493 and 1501, the Columbus expeditions, with the likely total possibly double that. Most were sent to the Seville area, where they seem to show up in the slave markets as Negroes. These are major contradictions to the whole slave trade myth. Blacks were always in America. The missing Indians are Negroes. The slaves sold on the slave markets in the South were initially the black people from right here in this hemisphere. As they took the lands here, they enslaved the inhabitants of those lands who were black. The tens of millions of Americans, so-called Indians, who disappeared after 1492 did not all die in the Holocaust inflicted within America. Many thousand were sent to Europe and Africa as slaves. The whole slave trade myth is that the whole story was given to us in reverse. A mass colony of Africans were not shipped from Africa to America, but the truth is that black Indians were shipped from America to Europe. They were then shipped from Spain to Africa as a commodity for African resources. These black Indians, now mistaken as Africans, were shipped back to America and classified as African slaves. This part of our history is what the school systems failed to mention in their history programs. Am I saying that there was no slave trade? There was indeed a kidnapping of Africans from Africa to America. However, it was the result of the mass shipment and slaughter of the Moors in America at the hands of the Columbus expeditions. Columbus's first journey in 1492 was a mission to capture gold, but he was sidetracked by the presence of the black Moors. Columbus sent the word back to the monarchs of Spain that there were what he referred to in his logs as the people of the Queen of Sheba. Columbus kidnapped Arawak Indians along with gold nuggets, exotic birds, and grain. Queen Isabella provided Columbus with 17 ships, 1,500 men, cannons, crossbows, guns, and attack dogs for the second voyage. Columbus's new mission was to conquer the West. When Columbus returned to the West, Haiti, and South America in 1493, he not only took raw materials and resources, but he abducted women. After a short time, the Arawaks resisted Columbus, and on March 25, 1495, Columbus slaughtered thousands of Arawak native men, women, and babies. Columbus also rounded up 1,500 Arawaks and shipped them to Spain. Columbus became the first man known in history to send the first slaves across the Atlantic. other nations rushed to emulate Columbus. In 1501, the Portuguese began to depopulate the Bituque Indians to Cape Verde as slaves. The Black Indian slavery destroyed the Indian nations of Natchez, the Yamasee, and the Pequots. Because of this, the first African slave raid took place in 1505 and was spearheaded by Columbus's son. When the Moors, the Indians of America, began dying and committing suicide, the labor was replaced with slaves from the Sahara in West Africa. Also, the gold and silver that Columbus extracted from America fueled a 400% inflation that eroded the economies of the non-European nations and helped Europe to develop a global market system. Africa suffered a great economical blow. The trans-Saharan trade collapsed because America supplied more precious gems than the African West Coast. African traders now only had one commodity that Europe wanted: slaves. African sultans thus sold their own black people into slavery to whites. It is safe to say that Columbus is solely responsible for slavery of the Moors, from west to east and from east to west. This is the bottom of an African slave ship. These were called big bottoms, as they were constructed to hold hundreds of Africans packed like sardines. These trips from Africa to America took up to 3 to 4 months from east to west. According to history, these hundreds of Africans urinated and defecated on themselves during the journey. Now come on, 4 months of constant urination and defecation? These slaves would have literally drowned. Does this story really make sense? The Dogons were already on American land because they simply sailed over by way of the worldwide wind and currents. The first Africans to set foot on American soil were in fact the Dogons of Mali, who used such currents as the Canary and the North Equilateral Current that recycles from West Africa to America and into the upper Atlantic Ocean. This was before the invention of sails. The Guinea current flows eastward along the Guinea coast, with frequent cycles out to the sea, where it joins the South Equatorial. The second group of Africans to land in America were under the leadership of Abu Bakari in 1311, and had mixed in with the Olmecs and became known as the Washoe. The third group of Africans to land on American soil were the Idrisids, who were the ruling dynasty of southern Morocco and Mauritania, who came into Morocco before the invasion by the Dogon Malians and the Senegalese. This group of Moors arrived in 1727 with Mensa Khan Musa, who was searching for his ancestors of Abu Bakari. And indeed, the Washoes were Moors. Let's go back a little bit more and explore this topic about the Moors. I previously stated that the Olmecs were of Mali, and that does make them Moors. Absolutely, the Olmecs were indeed Malian Moors. The Mayans were the descendants of the Malian Moors and were often referred to as Black Mexicans or Quetzalcoatl. There are ancient Mexican wall paintings that depict these Negroid kings as rulers and are unmistakably African. These Moors were the people who built the Great Pyramids all over South America, Peru, Canada, Alaska, and Georgia. Scattered all throughout North America along the Mississippi River and its tributaries are found mounds built out of tons of earth, tons and tons of earth. The people who built them were called the mound builders, and they were the descendants of the Malian Moors, the Olmecs. These Moors eventually migrated to North America from Mexico and became known as the Washita, the Yamasee, and the Ben Ismael tribe. The Ben Ismael tribe was a collection of what is known as the Lenape, the Wampanoag, and the Nanticoke Indians who migrated to Indiana and Illinois and referred to themselves as Moors, even though the United States government continued to classify them as Negroes in order to strip them of their indigenous rights. It is often not talked about, but the Moors had enslaved the Europeans before they enslaved blacks. Their women were sold like commodities into the harems and as concubines of wealthy Moors. This is the reason why the Moorish noble were for the most part bleached out, and became as tawny Moors, Turks, and Arabs, which are no more than fixed mulatto races. This is also the reason for the Moors in the coats of arms of the noble European families, this so-called black nobility of Europe. The European nations paid tribute to the Moors well into the 18th century. In the book, The United States and Barbary Powers, the English, French, Dutch, Danes, and Swedes, and may I say all nations, are tributary to them. David McRitchie in the book Ancient and Modern Britons says the word blackmail is the result of this tribute paid to the black army, or black oppressors as the English referred to them. The Moors had control of the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. This is why the Marines sing of defeating the Moors, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, confirming the extent of the Moorish Empire and dominions of Amexem, or Atlantis. Here you see the first page of the Moroccan Treaty of 1787. It should also be noted that Shakespeare's most famous Moor, Othello, is also described as a black African. Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin worked closely with Moors in the Continental Congress to secure this treaty. In the Bevins collection, there are over 200 letters to the Bey of Morocco from the Continental Congress. There were many Moors in the Continental Congress working with the European Masons originally taught by the Moors to form Novus Ordo Seclorum, the new secular order of the ages, e pluribus unum, out of many peoples, nations, one. The Moroccan Treaty is very powerful because, according to the Constitution, treaties are the law of the land. This treaty specifically deals with Moors. The question that may arise, how do we know that where the treaty says Moors, the so-called black people of the time is being referred to? The Moors were considered citizens or part of the we the people who ratified the Constitution. It says, quote, "Thus an act was passed in Massachusetts on the 6th of March, 1788, forbidding any Negro not a subject of the Empire of Morocco or citizen of the United States from tarrying in the Commonwealth," unquote. For this would show that those who referred to as Negroes were actually Moors, and that they were on the same footing or status as citizens. Those who remembered that they were Moors used the Moroccan Treaty of 1787 to secure the rights on the same footing as the state citizens without otherwise being obligated members of their social equality. While those who were brainwashed into believing they were Negroes, descendants of Africans brought here by Europeans, were unprotected by the Moroccan Treaty, as well as the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. This document says, and I quote, "A petition was presented to the House from free sundry Moors, subjects of the Emperor of Morocco, and residents in this state, praying that in case they should commit any fault amendable to be brought to justice, that they as subjects to a prince here in North America, in alliance with the United States of America, via the Moroccan Treaty of 1787, may be tried under the same laws as the citizens of this state would be liable to be tried, and not under the Negro Act, which was received and read." End quote. Thus, you have Moors back in 1789 saying what we say now. Our nationality is Moorish, not Negro, black, colored, etc.